In the shadow-laden corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, during the tumultuous years of the early 16th century, a man of modest stature but extraordinary intellect was quietly revolutionizing the very nature of power itself. Niccolò Machiavelli, stripped of his political position following the return of the Medici family to power in 1512, retreated to his small estate in Sant'Andrea in Percasina. There, in enforced exile, he would pen observations that would shake the foundations of political thought for centuries to come. What emerged from his quill was not merely a treatise on governance, but a codified system of principles that revealed the hidden mechanics of power, principles so effective and sometimes ruthless that his very name would become synonymous with cunning political maneuvering. Yet those who dismiss Machiavelli as merely advocating for cruelty miss the profound sophistication of his method, a systematic approach to understanding and wielding influence that transcended the moral platitudes of his era to reveal the raw dynamics that truly govern human affairs. The genius of Machiavelli's approach lay not in any single strategy, but in his ability to observe patterns of power across history and distill them into actionable principles. He studied the rise and fall of rulers from ancient Rome to his contemporary Italian city-states, identifying the consistent behaviors that separated those who thrived from those who perished in the brutal arena of politics. What he discovered was a secret method, a way of thinking about power that allowed its practitioners to anticipate, adapt, and ultimately triumph over their adversaries. Part 1: The Foundation of Strategic Thinking. The first revelation that would set Machiavelli apart from every political philosopher before him came during his diplomatic missions throughout Italy and beyond. As he observed the machinations of Cesare Borgia, the military campaigns of the French king, and the political maneuvering within the various Italian republics, he began to notice that successful leaders shared certain fundamental approaches to power that had little to do with the virtuous leadership extolled by classical philosophers. Principle 1: Master the art of calculated unpredictability. The foundation of Machiavelli's method rested on understanding that predictability in the exercise of power was tantamount to vulnerability. He observed how Cesare Borgia would alternate between acts of extreme generosity and sudden, decisive cruelty, keeping both allies and enemies in a constant state of uncertainty about his next move. This was not random behavior, but carefully orchestrated unpredictability designed to maximize his leverage in every situation. The principle operates on multiple levels. When adversaries cannot anticipate your actions, they cannot effectively prepare countermeasures. When allies never know whether they will receive reward or punishment, they remain attentive and compliant. When the general populace cannot predict whether you will be benevolent or harsh, they tend toward cautious respect rather than contemptuous familiarity. Machiavelli documented numerous historical examples where rulers lost power precisely because they became too predictable. The people of Florence had grown so accustomed to the Republican government's measured responses that they barely noticed when the Medici began their gradual return to power. Similarly, he noted how various condottieri, mercenary leaders, fell from grace when their opponents learned to anticipate their military strategies. Principle 2: Control information flow with ruthless precision. Perhaps no aspect of Machiavelli's method was more sophisticated than his understanding of information as the ultimate currency of power. He recognized that in politics, perception often mattered more than reality, and that controlling what people knew, and, when they knew it, could determine the outcome of any conflict. During his time as a diplomatic secretary, Machiavelli witnessed firsthand how the most successful leaders maintained multiple channels of information while strictly controlling what information flowed outward. They would plant false intelligence to mislead enemies, selectively share sensitive information to test the loyalty of subordinates, and time the release of news to maximize its impact on public opinion. The Borgias exemplified this principle. Cesare would often spread rumors about his own intentions that were completely false, causing his enemies to prepare for attacks that never came while leaving them vulnerable to his actual plans. Meanwhile, his extensive network of spies ensured that he knew his adversaries' plans often before they had fully formed them themselves. Machiavelli observed that information control operated through several mechanisms. First, the creation of dependency. When others rely on you for crucial information, they become naturally deferential. Second, the strategic creation of confusion among rivals. When your opponents spend their energy trying to decipher your true intentions, they have less energy to advance their own agendas. Third, the cultivation of mystique. When people cannot fully understand your methods, they tend to attribute greater power to you than you may actually possess. Principle 3: Forge alliances based on mutual benefit. never sentiment. One of the most critical observations Machiavelli made during his diplomatic career was that alliances based on personal friendship, shared values, or emotional bonds invariably proved fragile when tested by changing circumstances. The most enduring and effective alliances, he noted, were those built on clear, mutual self-interest that could adapt to evolving situations. The Italian city-states of his era provided countless examples of this principle in action. Florence's alliance with France endured not because of any shared cultural affinity, but because France needed Italian territorial access and Florence needed protection from more powerful neighbors. When circumstances changed, when France's strategic priorities shifted, the alliance naturally evolved rather than collapsing in betrayal and bitterness. Machiavelli observed that rulers who built alliances on mutual benefit were able to maintain larger and more stable networks of support. They could also more easily abandon alliances that no longer served their purposes without the psychological burden of betraying friendships. Most importantly, they could evaluate potential partners with clear-eyed pragmatism rather than being blinded by personal affection or ideological sympathy. This principle extended beyond formal political alliances to encompass all relationships within a ruler's sphere. The most effective leaders surrounded themselves with subordinates whose personal success was tied to the leader's success, creating natural incentives for loyalty without relying on personal devotion that might fade or be manipulated by rivals. Principle 4, appear weak when strong, strong when weak. The art of strategic deception formed a cornerstone of Machiavellian power dynamics. Through his analysis of successful military and political leaders, he identified a counterintuitive pattern. Those who appeared most formidable when they were actually vulnerable often survived their crises, while those who projected weakness during periods of strength frequently found themselves under attack when they could least afford it. This principle required extraordinary psychological discipline. When facing internal rebellion or external threats, the natural human tendency is to project strength to deter further challenges. However, Machiavelli observed that this often backfired by inspiring opponents to strike quickly before the ruler could fully mobilize their defenses. Conversely, when a leader was actually at the height of their power, appearing somewhat vulnerable could lull potential rivals into complacency or even encourage them to reveal their treacherous intentions prematurely. The Roman Empire provided numerous historical examples of this principle. Augustus rose to supreme power partly by appearing less threatening than his more obviously ambitious rivals, allowing them to eliminate each other while he quietly consolidated his base of support. Centuries later, various Byzantine emperors survived palace coups by appearing weak and ineffectual until they could identify and eliminate the conspiracy's leaders. Principle 5, study your enemies more closely than your friends. Machiavelli's diplomatic experience taught him that most rulers devoted inadequate attention to understanding their adversaries' true motivations, capabilities, and constraints. This oversight often proved fatal, as leaders would develop strategies based on superficial assessments of their opponents' likely responses. The most successful practitioners of power, however, made studying their enemies a systematic pursuit. They would analyze their opponents' past decisions to identify patterns of behavior, investigate their personal relationships to understand their emotional vulnerabilities, and carefully assess their resource bases to determine their real capabilities versus their projected strength. This intensive focus on enemies served multiple purposes. It revealed opportunities for exploitation that might otherwise be missed. It helped predict enemy responses to various strategies, allowing for more sophisticated planning. Most importantly, it often revealed that feared adversaries had significant weaknesses that could be exploited, or conversely, that seemingly weak opponents possessed hidden strengths that needed to be respected. Machiavelli noted that many political failures could be traced to leaders who had grown overconfident because they were surrounded by loyal supporters who reinforced their existing beliefs. These leaders often developed unrealistic assessments of their enemies' weaknesses while remaining blind to their own vulnerabilities. In contrast, leaders who maintained an almost obsessive focus on understanding their adversaries were rarely surprised by their opponents' moves and could often anticipate and counter them effectively. Principle 6, time your actions to coincide with your opponent's weakness. The element of timing in the exercise of power fascinated Machiavelli throughout his career. He observed that even the most well-conceived strategies could fail if implemented at the wrong moment, while relatively modest actions could achieve extraordinary results if timed to coincide with an opponent's moment of vulnerability. This principle required patience and careful observation. Successful leaders would often appear inactive for long periods, leading their enemies to conclude they lacked ambition or capability. In reality, they were waiting for the optimal moment to strike when their adversaries were distracted by other conflicts, weakened by internal divisions, or overextended in their commitments. The cyclical nature of political fortune meant that every leader, no matter how powerful, would eventually face moments of weakness. Economic troubles, succession crises, military defeats, or natural disasters all created opportunities for well-positioned rivals. The key was being prepared to act decisively when such moments arose, rather than being caught unprepared or acting too hastily when the timing was not yet optimal. Principle 7. Create multiple paths to every objective. Flexibility in strategy execution distinguished successful leaders from those who failed when their initial plans encountered obstacles. Machiavelli observed that the most effective practitioners of power never committed themselves to a single approach to achieving their goals. Instead, they developed multiple potential paths and remained prepared to switch between them as circumstances evolved. This principle applied to both long-term strategic objectives and immediate tactical challenges. A ruler seeking to expand their territory might simultaneously pursue military conquest, diplomatic alliance, economic pressure, and internal subversion. If one approach proved ineffective or too costly, they could seamlessly shift emphasis to another without abandoning their ultimate objective. The psychological advantage of maintaining multiple options was equally important. Leaders who possessed several potential approaches to any challenge projected confidence and adaptability that often intimidated their opponents. They were less likely to be cornered into desperate actions because they rarely faced situations where they had no alternatives remaining. Part 2. The Mechanics of Influence and Control. As Machiavelli delved deeper into his systematic study of power dynamics, he began to identify more sophisticated principles that governed how successful leaders maintained and expanded their influence. These observations moved beyond basic strategic thinking to encompass the psychological and social mechanisms that determined whether a leader's power would prove durable or ephemeral. Principle 8. Cultivate fear and love simultaneously, but never hatred. One of Machiavelli's most nuanced insights concerned the complex relationship between a leader's reputation and their security. Through his analysis of numerous historical examples, he concluded that the most stable form of power rested on inspiring both fear and love while scrupulously avoiding hatred. Fear alone, while effective in the short term, bred resentment and secret plotting. Love alone, while personally satisfying for the leader, often led to being taken for granted and eventually challenged by those who no longer respected the leader's resolve. Hatred, however, was the most dangerous emotion to inspire because it motivated sustained opposition regardless of the personal cost to one's enemies. The art lay in inspiring fear of one's capabilities and resolve while simultaneously demonstrating genuine care for the welfare of one's subjects. A leader might ruthlessly punish those who betrayed trust while generously rewarding those who served faithfully. They might demonstrate terrifying efficiency in eliminating external threats while showing mercy and wisdom in resolving internal disputes. Machiavelli observed that leaders who mastered this balance created a psychological dynamic where people wanted to be on their side rather than against them. Subjects would fear the consequences of opposition while simultaneously believing that loyalty would be recognized and rewarded. This created a form of voluntary submission that was far more stable than compliance based purely on coercion. Principle 9. Control the narrative of your actions. The importance of controlling how events were interpreted and remembered became increasingly apparent to Machiavelli as he studied the long-term success and failure of various rulers. He realized that the same action could enhance or destroy a leader's reputation depending on how it was framed and explained to both contemporary audiences and future historians. Successful leaders invested considerable effort in crafting narratives that justified their actions while reinforcing their desired image. When they acted harshly, they ensured that their actions were understood as necessary responses to threats or betrayals. When they showed mercy, they presented it as evidence of their wisdom and magnanimity rather than weakness. When they made alliances, they portrayed them as strategic masterstrokes rather than desperate necessities. This principle extended beyond immediate public relations to encompass the systematic cultivation of loyal chroniclers, artists, and intellectuals who would ensure that history remembered the leader favorably. The most far-sighted practitioners of power understood that their contemporary reputation mattered less than their historical legacy, which would influence how future generations understood and wielded power. The Roman emperors provided excellent examples of this principle in action. Augustus transformed the narrative of the civil wars from a story of his personal ambition into an account of his reluctant acceptance of responsibility to save the Republic from chaos. This narrative served him well both during his lifetime and, in the historical record, influencing how subsequent rulers understood and justified their own power. Principle 10. Make others dependent on your success. Perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Machiavellian power management involved creating webs of dependency that made others naturally invested in the leader's continued success. Rather than relying solely on fear or personal loyalty, the most effective leaders structured their relationships so that their subordinates' own interests were served by the leader's prosperity and threatened by the leader's downfall. This principle operated through various mechanisms. Economic dependency could be created by controlling access to resources, opportunities, or markets that subordinates needed for their own success. Political dependency developed when a leader's supporters owed their positions or influence to the leader's favor. Social dependency emerged when association with the leader provided status or access that would be lost if the leader fell from power. The genius of this approach was that it transformed potential rivals into defenders. When a leader's success became prerequisite for others' success, those others had strong incentives to support the leader against external threats and to discourage internal challenges from emerging. They became, in effect, a distributed intelligence and security network working on the leader's behalf. Machiavelli observed numerous examples of leaders who failed to implement this principle and, consequently, found themselves isolated when crises arose. Conversely, those who successfully created dependency networks often survived challenges that should have overwhelmed them because their supporters had powerful reasons to ensure their survival. Principle 11. Delegate authority while retaining ultimate control. The challenge of scaling personal power beyond what a single individual could directly manage required sophisticated approaches to delegation that preserved ultimate control while enabling efficient administration. Machiavelli studied how successful rulers managed this delicate balance, identifying patterns that separated effective delegation from dangerous dispersion of power. The key insight was that authority could be delegated while maintaining control over the systems that granted and revoked that authority. Effective leaders would give subordinates significant freedom to act within their spheres of responsibility while ensuring that their continued authority depended on the leader's ongoing approval. This required careful design of institutional structures, information systems, and incentive mechanisms. The most successful practitioners of this principle created overlapping spheres of authority that prevented any single subordinate from becoming too powerful while ensuring that the leader remained informed about activities throughout their domain. They would rotate assignments to prevent subordinates from developing independent power bases, while simultaneously providing enough stability for competent administration. This approach allowed leaders to benefit from their subordinates' expertise and energy while maintaining ultimate decision-making authority. It also created a form of controlled competition among subordinates that often improved performance while reducing the risk of coordinated challenges to the leader's position. Principle 12. Master the art of strategic patience. The temporal dimension of power proved crucial to Machiavelli's understanding of why some leaders succeeded over the long term while others achieved brief victories followed by dramatic failures. He identified strategic patience, the ability to subordinate immediate desires to long-term objectives, as one of the most important qualities distinguishing truly successful leaders from those who merely achieve temporary prominence. Strategic patience manifested in several ways. It meant accepting smaller gains in the short term to avoid provoking premature opposition. It involved building capabilities slowly and methodically rather than seeking dramatic but unsustainable expansion. It required resisting the temptation to settle scores immediately when long-term interests suggested waiting for better opportunities. The most patient leaders often appeared less dynamic than their more impulsive rivals, leading observers to underestimate their ambitions and capabilities. This worked to their advantage, as potential opponents would focus their attention on more obvious threats while the patient leader quietly strengthened their position and waited for optimal moments to advance their interests. Machiavelli noted that strategic patience was particularly important during periods of apparent weakness. Leaders who could resist the natural human tendency to take desperate actions when under pressure often found that their restraint allowed problems to resolve themselves or created opportunities to turn apparent defeats into eventual victories. Principle 13. Adapt your methods to changing circumstances. The dynamic nature of political and social environments meant that rigid adherence to any single approach to power management would eventually prove inadequate. Machiavelli observed that the most successful leaders possessed an almost chameleon-like ability to modify their methods as circumstances evolved while maintaining consistency in their ultimate objectives. This adaptability extended beyond mere tactical flexibility to encompass fundamental approaches to leadership style. A leader might need to be highly collaborative during periods when building coalitions was essential, then switch to more authoritarian methods when rapid decision-making became critical. They might emphasize their common origins during times when populist appeal was important, then stress their unique qualifications when establishing authority over rivals. The challenge lay in making these adaptations appear natural rather than calculated. Leaders who seemed to change their personalities arbitrarily lost credibility and trustworthiness. However, those who could frame their adaptations as appropriate responses to evolving challenges maintained their authority while gaining effectiveness in diverse situations. Successful adaptation required accurate assessment of changing conditions, which returned to the importance of maintaining excellent intelligence about both internal and external developments. Leaders who remained locked into approaches that had served them well in the past often found themselves increasingly ineffective as circumstances evolved around them. Principle 14. Use conflict to strengthen your position. Counter to the intuitive preference for harmony and stability, Machiavelli observed that skillfully managed conflict could actually strengthen a leader's position by eliminating rivals, clarifying loyalties, and demonstrating capability. The key was ensuring that conflicts were chosen carefully and managed to produce favorable outcomes rather than simply allowing conflicts to emerge randomly. Effective leaders would sometimes encourage conflicts between their subordinates to prevent them from coordinating challenges to the leader's authority. They would also deliberately provoke conflicts with external opponents when they possessed advantages that ensured victory, using successful conflicts to enhance their reputation and intimidate future challengers. The timing and scale of conflicts required careful management. Small conflicts that could be won decisively were preferable to large conflicts that might destabilize the entire system. Conflicts that clarified important principles or eliminated ambiguities in relationships were more valuable than conflicts over trivial issues that might appear petty. Most importantly, every conflict had to serve larger strategic objectives rather than merely satisfying emotional impulses. Leaders who engaged in conflicts for personal satisfaction or to settle scores often found that the costs exceeded the benefits, while those who used conflict as a tool for advancing their broader interests typically emerged stronger from their challenges. Part 3. The Ultimate Mastery of Power. The final dimension of Machiavelli's method encompassed the most advanced principles that separated true masters of power from merely successful practitioners. These insights addressed how power could be not only acquired and maintained, but transformed into lasting influence that would endure beyond the leader's own lifetime. Principle 15. Shape the system rather than just operating within it. The most profound level of power involved influencing the very structures and assumptions within which others operated, rather than simply maneuvering more skillfully within existing constraints. Machiavelli recognized that leaders who could reshape institutions, laws, customs, or expectations possessed a form of power that was both more subtle and more enduring than conventional approaches. This principle operated through several mechanisms. Institutional reform could embed a leader's preferences into the ongoing structures of governance, ensuring that their influence would persist even after they were no longer personally directing activities. Cultural change could alter the fundamental assumptions that people use to evaluate political actions, making certain approaches appear natural while rendering others unthinkable. The Roman transformation from republic to empire provided the clearest historical example of this principle. Augustus did not simply seize power through conventional means, he gradually restructured the entire political system while maintaining the appearance of republican traditions. By the time his reforms were complete, the concentration of power in a single ruler had become the new normal, and attempts to restore the previous system would have appeared radical rather than conservative. Modern applications of this principle might involve establishing new precedents that would constrain future opponents, creating economic or social dependencies that made certain policies irreversible, or fundamentally altering the terms of political discourse to favor one's preferred approaches. Principle 16. Create loyalties that transcend personal relationships. While personal loyalty had value, Machiavelli observed that the most durable forms of support were based on something more substantial than individual relationships. The leaders who created lasting influence were those who could inspire loyalty to ideas, institutions, or causes that were larger than their own persons. This approach provided multiple advantages. It created more stable foundations for power because supporters remained committed even during periods when the leader might be personally absent, incapacitated, or facing challenges. It attracted higher quality supporters who were motivated by principle rather than merely personal advantage. Most importantly, it enabled the creation of lasting movements that could survive and continue the leader's work beyond their own lifetime. The challenge lay in developing causes or institutions that were genuinely compelling while ensuring that the leader remained closely identified with them. The most successful practitioners managed to become so closely associated with their causes that supporting the cause required supporting the leader, while opposition to the leader appeared to be opposition to the cause itself. Religious and ideological movements provided clear examples of this principle, but it could also be applied in purely secular contexts through institutional innovation, economic development programs, or cultural initiatives that improved people's lives in ways that would be attributed to the leader's vision and capability. Principle 17. Plan for succession without creating rivals. The ultimate test of a leader's mastery of power was their ability to ensure continuity of their influence beyond their own active participation. This required the extraordinary delicate task of preparing successors who would continue their work while ensuring that those potential successors did not become threats to their current position. Machiavelli studied numerous examples of succession planning, noting that most leaders either failed to plan for succession at all, leaving chaos upon their departure, or created succession systems that enabled their designated heirs to challenge their authority prematurely. The most sophisticated approaches involved developing multiple potential successors while maintaining uncertainty about which would ultimately be chosen. Successful succession planning also required creating systems that would preserve the leader's key achievements regardless of who eventually inherited their position. This might involve institutional reforms that would be difficult to reverse, cultural changes that had become accepted as natural, or economic arrangements that created powerful constituencies for maintaining the leader's policies. The Roman imperial system provided one model, where capable emperors would adopt promising subordinates while ensuring that their authority remained unquestioned during their lifetimes. The most successful implementations of this approach created smooth transitions that maintained stability while preserving the previous leader's essential contributions. Principle 18. Transform power into authority. The distinction between power and authority became increasingly important as Machiavelli observed how different forms of influence aged over time. Power based purely on force, wealth, or political maneuvering often proved fragile when tested by sustained challenges. Authority, however, represented a form of influence that people accepted as legitimate and natural, making it far more stable and efficient. The transformation from power to authority required demonstrating competence, wisdom, and genuine concern for the welfare of those being led. It involved making decisions that were recognized as beneficial even by those who might prefer different approaches. Most importantly, it required consistency over time that allowed people to develop trust in the leader's judgment and intentions. Authority also possessed a self-reinforcing quality that power lacked. Once people accepted a leader's authority, they were more likely to comply with directives even when they disagreed with specific decisions. They would also be more likely to defend the leader against challenges from others, seeing such challenges as threats to legitimate governance rather than acceptable political competition. The development of authority was a gradual process that could not be rushed or forced. It required authentic demonstration of the qualities that made authority worthy of respect, rather than merely projecting an image of those qualities. Leaders who successfully made this transformation found that their influence became both more effective and less exhausting to maintain. Principle 19. Leave room for others to save face. The psychological dimension of power relationships proved crucial to maintaining long-term stability and effectiveness. Machiavelli observed that leaders who humiliated their opponents or forced them into positions where they had nothing left to lose often created unnecessarily dangerous enemies. The most sophisticated practitioners of power learned to achieve their objectives while allowing opponents to maintain dignity and hope for future rehabilitation. This principle did not require weakness or excessive mercy. Instead, it involved strategic magnanimity that reduced the likelihood of desperate opposition while demonstrating the leader's confidence and wisdom. When opponents were defeated, they could be offered paths to redemption that served the leader's interests while providing them with incentives to accept their new positions rather than plotting revenge. The Roman practice of incorporating defeated enemies into their system, sometimes even elevating them to positions of honor, provided a historical model for this approach. By treating former opponents with respect once they accepted Roman authority, Rome created a powerful incentive for submission while reducing the appeal of continued resistance. Modern applications might involve offering defeated political rivals opportunities to contribute to governance in ways that utilized their expertise while ensuring their loyalty, or structuring negotiations so that all parties could claim some measure of success even when one side clearly achieved superior outcomes. Principle 20. Maintain the appearance of acting for higher purposes. The most effective leaders learned to frame their actions as serving causes or principles that transcended their personal interests, even when their personal benefit was obvious to careful observers. This principle recognized that people preferred to support leaders who appeared to be motivated by noble purposes rather than mere self-advancement. The key to implementing this principle was identifying genuine benefits that the leader's success would provide to others, then emphasizing those benefits while downplaying personal advantages. This approach was most effective when the higher purposes were authentic rather than merely rhetorical, as people could usually sense whether a leader's stated motivations matched their actual priorities. Historical examples ranged from military leaders who framed their campaigns as defending their people or spreading civilization, to political reformers who presented their rise to power as necessary for implementing beneficial changes that others had been unable or unwilling to pursue. The psychological appeal of this approach was that it allowed people to feel good about supporting the leader while providing the leader with moral authority that enhanced their political effectiveness. It also created frameworks for evaluating the leader's actions that emphasized positive outcomes rather than focusing on how those actions served the leader's personal interests. Principle 21. Always preserve your options to retreat or advance. The final principle in Machiavelli's systematic analysis addressed the importance of maintaining strategic flexibility regardless of how successful or secure a leader's position might appear. History demonstrated repeatedly that even the most powerful leaders could face unexpected challenges that threatened their survival, while apparently hopeless situations sometimes presented sudden opportunities for dramatic advancement. Preserving options required avoiding commitments that could not be reversed when circumstances changed. It meant maintaining relationships with potential allies even when their support was not currently needed. It involved developing capabilities that might prove useful in unforeseen situations, even when current strategies seemed adequate. Most importantly, it required psychological preparation for both success and failure. Leaders who became too invested in any particular outcome often made poor decisions when those outcomes appeared threatened. Conversely, those who could adapt to unexpected developments while maintaining their core objectives often turned apparent setbacks into eventual triumphs. The preservation of options also applied to reputation management. Leaders needed to maintain enough credibility in multiple different roles or approaches that they could reinvent themselves when their current approach was no longer effective. This might involve building relationships across political or social divisions, developing expertise in multiple areas, or maintaining personal reserves that could support different strategies as needed. The enduring legacy of Machiavellian method. As Machiavelli concluded his systematic analysis of power dynamics, he recognized that he had identified something far more significant than mere political tactics. He had uncovered the fundamental patterns that govern human behavior in competitive environments, patterns that would remain relevant regardless of how political institutions or social customs might evolve over time. The 21 principles formed an integrated system that could be applied at any scale, from personal relationships to international diplomacy. They provided a framework for understanding why certain approaches to influence consistently succeeded while others failed, regardless of the specific context in which they were employed. Perhaps most importantly, Machiavelli had demonstrated that power was not a mysterious force that some people possess through birth or luck, but a set of skills and insights that could be studied, understood, and systematically applied. This democratization of power knowledge would prove to be one of his most revolutionary contributions to human understanding. The effectiveness of Machiavellian principles extended beyond their immediate practical applications to their impact on how people thought about leadership and influence. By providing a systematic framework for analyzing power relationships, these principles enabled more sophisticated approaches to both acquiring and responding to the exercise of power by others. Yet Machiavelli also understood that knowledge of these principles would not automatically ensure success. Their effective application required judgment, patience, and the psychological fortitude to act decisively when opportunities arose. Most importantly, they required the intellectual honesty to see situations as they actually were rather than as one might wish them to be. The secret method that Machiavelli used to outsmart everyone was ultimately his willingness to observe human behavior without the filtering lens of conventional morality or traditional political theory. By focusing on what actually worked rather than what should work according to prevailing wisdom, he was able to identify patterns that others had missed and develop strategies that proved effective precisely because they were based on realistic assessments of human nature and social dynamics. The 21 principles thus represented more than tactical advice for aspiring leaders. They constituted a comprehensive approach to understanding and navigating the complex realities of human interaction in competitive environments. Their enduring relevance across centuries and cultures testifies to their foundation in fundamental aspects of human psychology and social organization that transcend the specific historical circumstances of early 16th century Italy. For contemporary readers, these principles offer insights that extend far beyond traditional political applications. In an era of complex organizations, global communications, and rapidly changing social dynamics, the ability to understand and effectively respond to power relationships remains as crucial as it was in Machiavelli's time. The specific tactics may evolve with changing technology and social structures, but the underlying principles continue to provide valuable guidance for anyone seeking to understand and influence the human dynamics that shape our shared future. The true genius of Machiavelli's method lay not in any particular technique or strategy, but in his systematic approach to learning from experience and his willingness to challenge conventional assumptions when they conflicted with observed reality. These qualities, intellectual courage, systematic observation, and pragmatic flexibility, remain as valuable today as they were 5 centuries ago, offering timeless guidance for anyone seeking to understand the complex dynamics of power and influence in human affairs. Through careful study and thoughtful application of these principles, modern practitioners can develop their own mastery of the subtle arts of leadership and influence, adapting Machiavelli's insights to contemporary challenges while honoring the intellectual legacy of one of history's most penetrating analysts of human behavior in competitive environments. The secret method that made Machiavelli so effective was ultimately his commitment to understanding reality as it actually exists, rather than as we might prefer it to be, a lesson that remains as relevant and powerful today as it was in the shadowed halls of Renaissance Italy.